Imagine sitting in a luxurious restaurant savoring a meal that costs more than most people's monthly rent. Suddenly, a young girl approaches you on the sidewalk asking for your leftovers. You expect her to devour the food on the spot, but instead she carefully packs it away and runs off without a word. What would you do? Hello, everyone. Enjoy these relaxing moments as you watch. Richard Grant, a successful millionaire, didn't just ignore the girl, he followed her. What he discovered next would haunt him forever, leaving him to question everything he thought he knew about wealth, power, and what truly matters. Stay with us to see how this encounter leads to a decision that will change the lives of two innocent children, and his own, forever. The night was perfect for a lavish dinner at the Golden Plate, one of the most prestigious restaurants in downtown Portland. It's the kind of place where billionaires and moguls come to unwind, where every bite of food costs more than most people's rent and the air is thick with the smell of luxury. The flickering candlelight reflected off the marble floors, and the soft clink of glasses echoed throughout the room. Richard Grant, a 52-year-old founder of a tech empire, sat at a corner table absent-mindedly adjusting his silk tie while checking his phone. He had just doubled his stock value, and tonight was supposed to be his victory dinner. The quiet hum of the restaurant was a far cry from the chaos he usually thrived on. With a sharp breath, Richard swirled his red wine in the glass, the deep burgundy color mesmerizing against the ambient lighting. He was at the peak of his career, yet something felt off. Perhaps it was the weight of too many years of success, or the loneliness of being at the top. But tonight, as he stared at the glowing numbers on his screen, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something. That's when he saw her. A small movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. At first, he thought it was just another beggar hoping for handouts. But when he turned his gaze, it was different. There she stood, barely 5 years old, her small frame swallowed by a faded yellow dress and worn-out sandals. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a desperate hunger that wasn't just for food. Richard's jaw tightened, and a cold shiver ran down his spine. The girl was staring at his plate of half-eaten lobster with an intensity that unnerved him. "Can I have the rest of your food, mister? I'm hungry." Her voice was barely above a whisper, hardly registering in the noise of the restaurant. But the words hit Richard like a slap in the face. His first instinct was to wave her off or call security. Perhaps the elite don't interact with street urchins, right? But there was something in her eyes that stopped him. Something familiar, a memory from his own childhood buried long ago. He stared at the girl, unsure of why he couldn't look away. The waiter, sensing the tension, moved to intervene, but Richard raised a hand to stop him. The situation felt different. He wasn't sure why. There was something in the girl's gaze, something that made him uneasy. That look made him feel like a part of his humanity had been buried beneath all the wealth and power he had accumulated over the years. He pushed the plate toward her. "Take it," he said, his voice cold and distant, as if speaking through glass. The girl's eyes flickered with surprise, but she didn't devour the food as Richard had expected. Instead, she handled the lobster and vegetables with almost reverent care, gently sliding them into a crumpled plastic bag. "Thank you, mister," she whispered before hurrying off down the sidewalk. Richard was left staring at the empty plate. He should have been glad, proud of himself for offering help, but something felt wrong. Something gnawed at his gut. Why didn't she eat right there? Why the rush? Why was she alone? Just a child like that? Why wasn't she with her family? The questions echoed in his mind, growing louder with each passing second. Without thinking, Richard stood up, dropped a few bills onto the table, and ignored the curious stares from the other patrons. He couldn't just let it go. He had to follow her, had to know what was going on. He pushed past the velvet curtains of the restaurant and stepped into the cool night air. The city lights flickered in the distance, but the streets felt eerily quiet. His expensive Italian leather shoes clicked sharply against the pavement as he moved, his pulse quickening with each step. Why was he doing this? What was he expecting to find? His eyes scanned the area. Ahead, he saw her again, running down the street, her small figure darting into an alley. His mind raced, the image of her so fragile, her small hands clutching that plastic bag replaying over and over. This wasn't just a street urchin looking for a meal. No, there was more to this story. He followed her into the alley, but when he reached the entrance, his legs froze. What he saw next made his heart stop. Mia was kneeling beside another child, a girl even smaller than her, no more than 2 years old, lying motionless on the ground. Richard's breath hitched in his throat. The younger girl's lips were cracked, her skin pale and burning with fever. Mia gently shook her sister's shoulder, whispering words too soft to hear. But when the younger girl didn't stir, Mia Claire's voice broke. "I brought food, Annie Beth. Wake up and eat. It's lobster, just like Grandma used to talk about in her stories," Mia murmured desperately. Richard's knees buckled as he crouched down beside them. The scene was more than he could handle. It was too real, too raw. This was happening just yards from a restaurant where people spent fortunes on meals. And here were two children, starving. Starving. "Please wake up," Mia whispered again, tears streaming down her face as she cradled her sister. It hit him like a tidal wave, the sheer cruelty of it all. These two innocent children were dying from hunger in a world overflowing with abundance. Without thinking, Richard reached for his phone. His hands trembled as he dialed 911, his voice cracking as he relayed the emergency. The ambulance would be there soon. He could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. But as he stared at Mia Claire, trying to comfort her sister, a part of him couldn't help but wonder, what if he'd never followed her? What if he had just gone back inside, finished his meal, and gone on with his life? But he hadn't. And now there was no going back. Do you think Richard's decision to follow the girl was driven by guilt or genuine concern? What does it say about his character? Richard's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped further into the dark alley, his thoughts spinning in a whirlwind. The cold air stung his face, but the chill was nothing compared to the tightness in his chest. His footsteps echoed off the narrow walls. He couldn't shake the image of Mia Claire's face, the desperation in her eyes as she ran off with the food. Something wasn't right, and he needed to find out what it was. The alley was quieter than he expected. It was a place forgotten by the city, tucked away in the shadow of towering buildings that seemed to ignore it entirely. The streetlights barely reached this far, leaving only dim flickering pools of light. Deeper into the alley, he saw her again. Mia Claire was kneeling beside the motionless body of her younger sister, Annie Beth. The sight was like a punch to the gut. Richard's breath caught in his throat. His instincts screamed that something was terribly wrong. The younger girl was pale, her lips cracked and dry, her skin burning with a fever that made Richard's stomach turn. Mia was gently shaking her, trying to wake her up, but the child didn't stir. The scene in front of him was heart-wrenching, a cold slap to the face of everything Richard had ever known. "This can't be real," Richard whispered to himself, his mind struggling to process what was happening. He had seen poverty before, the kind of destitution that made his stomach turn. But this was different. These weren't just two random street children. Mia Claire was looking at her sister with a kind of worn-out resilience and unnatural maturity in her eyes that no child should ever possess. And Annie Beth, with her skin burning hot to the touch, wasn't just sick, she was dying. Richard found his voice again, rough as if he hadn't spoken in years. The little girl's head snapped up, her wide brown eyes locking with his. There was no fear in them, just a deep, unsettling weariness, like she'd already seen the worst life had to offer, and worse, she expected nothing better. Richard kneeled down beside them, his expensive suit now a distant memory. As he reached out to touch Annie Beth's clammy skin, his fingers lingered there for a moment before he withdrew. The sensation of the child's feverish heat made his heart lurch. "What's happened to her?" Richard's voice cracked, his hands trembling despite himself. Mia Claire's gaze didn't waver. For a moment, Richard could see the weight of years pressing down on her small shoulders. It was as though she'd already seen the world's cruelty in full, with no expectation that anyone would offer her salvation. "She won't wake up," Mia Claire whispered, her voice low but steady. "She hasn't woken up in hours. I think I think she's too weak. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. His thoughts scattered, trying to piece together what was happening before his eyes. How could this be happening so close to the upscale restaurant where he had just eaten? Where people spent more on wine than these girls would ever see in their lifetimes. "Please wake up, Annie Beth," Mia Claire said, her voice trembling with emotion that cut through the numbness of her words. "I brought food for us." Richard's mind raced. This couldn't be happening. He had to do something. He couldn't just stand there and watch these girls wither away. But the desperation in Mia Claire's eyes told him she didn't believe in help anymore. She didn't believe in anything but the harsh truth that no one cared enough to change her world. His phone was already in his hand. He dialed 911, the numbers tumbling out with the urgency of someone who had long since lost hope in the system. He could barely form the words as he spoke into the phone, giving them the details. A child in critical condition, possibly dying from hunger and neglect. The operator's calm voice didn't match the storm raging inside Richard's mind, but he held on, as if the words on the other end could somehow make the situation better. When the call ended, Richard turned back to Mia Claire and her sister. Mia was sitting back on her heels now, her small fingers clutching a locket she had pulled from her pocket. She looked at it as if it were her lifeline, her only connection to a world that had once been warm and safe. Richard couldn't help but glance at it, his eyes narrowing when he saw the faded photo inside. It was an old picture of a woman who looked oddly familiar. "Who is this?" Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. But even as the words left his lips, he knew the answer. "Grandma," Mia Claire said, her voice thick with emotion. "She's the one who told us stories. She's the one who promised we wouldn't end up like this." Richard felt his heart skip a beat. The woman in the photo looked so familiar. Too familiar. "Your grandmother?" Richard asked, trying to steady his breath. The recognition hit him like a freight train. The photo was of Miss Emily, the woman who had been a mother to him when he was abandoned as a child. The same woman who had taught him that even in the darkest places there was a sliver of hope, a sliver of humanity that could change everything. The same woman who had given him a chance at a life he never dreamed of. The reality crashed over him like a wave. Mia Claire and Annie Beth were the granddaughters of Miss Emily, the woman who had saved his life all those years ago when he was just another orphan on the streets. He had forgotten her calls, ignored her letters, buried her in the dust of his empire. And now the same woman's granddaughters were sitting in front of him, starving, waiting for someone, anyone, to help them. "I know her," Richard stammered, his voice thick with emotion. I knew your grandmother." Mia Claire looked up at him, her eyes wide with shock. "You knew her?" I'm sorry," Richard said, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry I didn't help her when she needed it. But I'm here now, and I'm going to help you. I promise." As the ambulance sirens wailed in the distance, Richard felt the weight of his decision settle on him. He wasn't just helping two lost children. He was trying to make up for the wrongs he had ignored, the debt he never knew he owed. Thanks for watching. Sorry for the interruption, but we hope you will help us improve our content in the future. What do you think Richard's next steps should be? Should he take responsibility for the girls, or is he overstepping his boundaries? What's your opinion? Let's hear your thoughts in the comments. The days that followed were a blur of hospital visits, phone calls, and arrangements. Richard never thought he'd find himself making these decisions, but Mia Claire and Annie Beth were in recovery now. Still, the damage had been done. Annie Beth had been severely malnourished, and Mia, despite her youthful spirit, bore scars of neglect far beyond her years. Richard spent every waking hour at Riverside Hospital, sitting by their side, feeling a responsibility settle over him, like a weight that would never lift. It was overwhelming, yes, but it was also a turning point in his life. For the first time in years, he felt something real, something more profound than the success of his company or the hollow victories of the business world. It was Mia Claire who surprised him the most. Despite the trauma, despite everything she had been through, she wasn't the broken, timid child he had expected. Instead, she had a quiet strength, a resilience that came from a place he couldn't quite understand. She wasn't looking for someone to save her, but rather someone who would stand by her side. I told Grandma we would be okay, Mia Claire said one evening, her small hands clasped tightly around the locket she always carried, the same locket she had shown Richard days before. She promised me that one day everything would be better. She said, sometimes people just need a little help to remember the good things. Richard's heart ached as he listened to her words. There it was again. The same message that had been instilled in him years ago, in the very children's home where he had once found refuge. Miss Emily had believed in the goodness of people, and now it seemed Mia Claire carried that same belief within her, despite all that life had thrown her way. As days turned into weeks, Richard found himself spending less time with corporate matters. He had taken a leave of absence from his role as CEO of his company, something unthinkable just a few months ago, but now it felt right. There was nothing more important than these two girls, these innocent souls who had been left to fend for themselves in a world that had turned a blind eye. In the meantime, Richard worked tirelessly to ensure that both girls had everything they needed: medical care, therapy, and most importantly, love. With the support of a team of professionals, including a child psychologist, the girls slowly began to heal. Annie Beth was still fragile, but with each passing day she grew stronger. Her eyes brightened. Her laughter became more frequent. Mia Claire remained her rock, a motherly figure in a small, fragile body. Even she was learning to let go of the responsibility she had carried for so long. One evening, as Richard sat with them in the living room of his mansion, the girls were drawing at the table, their giggles filling the air. Richard watched them, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and guilt. These two girls had become his world in such a short time. The promise he had made to Miss Emily, to help them, was now more than just a debt. It was his purpose. You know, Richard said, watching them draw, I think Grandma would have loved this place. Mia Claire looked up from her sketching, her eyes bright with curiosity. You think so? She asked softly. I know so, Richard replied, his voice thick with emotion. I think she would have been proud of you too. He paused, taking a deep breath. I promised her once that I would repay her kindness. I think this is my chance. The days passed, and with each one, Richard found himself more entwined in the lives of Mia Claire and Annie Beth. He had become more than just their temporary guardian. He had become their family. The bond that had been formed in those early, painful days of uncertainty blossomed into something real, something undeniable. But the biggest test still lay ahead. Anthony Collins, their father, was still battling his demons. After his overdose, he had entered rehab, struggling to fight the addiction that had ravaged his life for so long. The road to recovery was never easy, and though Richard had promised the girls that things would get better, he couldn't ignore the difficult reality. Anthony was still their father. Despite everything, they loved him. One morning, Richard received a call from Anthony's rehab clinic. The therapist informed him that Anthony had made significant progress and wanted to speak with Mia Claire and Annie Beth. Richard had mixed emotions. He had promised the girls they would never go through the same pain again, but he also knew that their father's recovery was crucial. It was a delicate balance. Sitting beside her on the couch, Richard said, Your dad wants to talk to you. He's doing better, and he wants to see you. Mia's eyes flickered with a mixture of emotions. Hope, fear, confusion. Do you think he'll be different? She asked quietly. Richard took her hand gently. I believe he's trying, but it's up to you whether or not you're ready to trust him again. The day of the meeting arrived. Richard sat with Mia Claire and Annie Beth in the rehab clinic's visitor's room. The door opened, and Anthony Collins walked in. His face was thinner, his eyes clearer than they had been in years. The man who had once been so broken was now trying to make amends for all the years lost to addiction. Annie Beth was the first to move, running into Anthony's arms, her small hands clutching his worn shirt. Mia Claire stood still for a moment, watching the reunion unfold before her. Then she finally walked to him, her hand trembling in Richard's. I'm sorry, Anthony whispered, voice thick with emotion. I know I failed you both. I'm here now. I'm trying. I want to be the dad you deserve. Mia Claire nodded slowly, her eyes filled with both hope and caution. We want to understand, Daddy, she said softly. But you have to promise. Promise you won't run away anymore. I promise, Anthony said, his voice breaking. I'm not running anymore. Richard watched the scene, heart heavy with emotions he didn't know how to name. It was a slow, painful process. This rebuilding of trust, this healing of broken relationships. But it was happening, and that was enough. How do you feel about the way Richard has stepped into the role of a father for the girls? Do you think he's doing the right thing? This story teaches us the profound importance of human connection, compassion, and second chances. It highlights how the choices we make, whether big or small, can change the course of someone's life. Richard Grant's decision to step into the lives of Mia Claire and Annie Beth wasn't just an act of charity, it was a moment of personal growth. He learned that true success isn't measured by wealth or achievements, but by the ability to give love, care, and support when it's needed most. Moreover, Mia Claire and Annie Beth show us the resilience of the human spirit. Despite their traumatic past, they remained hopeful, proving that even in the darkest times, love and kindness can make a difference. The story also reminds us that healing, both physical and emotional, takes time and requires patience and understanding. True family isn't defined solely by blood but by those who choose to stand by each other no matter the circumstances. If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon!